The date on your food is not an expiration date. It never was. There's no federal law in the United States and no binding regulation in most countries on Earth that requires food manufacturers to tell you when their product actually becomes unsafe to eat. What is printed on the package is something else entirely. It is a marketing tool, and the industry that created it knew exactly what it was building when it built it. Pull back for a second and look at the scale of what that misunderstanding costs. The FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, estimates that roughly 1/3 of all food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted every single year. 1/3. That is approximately 1.3 billion tons of food gone annually. A significant portion of that waste happens at the consumer level in homes, because people read a date on a package and make a decision based on what they believe that date means. What they believe it means and what it actually means are two entirely different things. And the industry responsible for the confusion has never had much incentive to correct it. So what does the date actually mean? That depends entirely on which label you are reading. And the labels are not consistent, not regulated in the same way across countries, and not required to communicate the same thing. Best By means the manufacturer believes the product will be at peak quality until that date. Flavor, texture, color. Not safety, quality. Sell By is a message to the retailer about how long to display the product on the shelf. It has almost nothing to do with whether the food is safe to eat after that point. Use By comes closest to what people assume all these dates mean, but even use by is not universally a safety date. In many categories, it simply reflects the manufacturer's confidence window. These three phrases are used interchangeably by consumers worldwide. They mean three completely different things, and the system was designed to be exactly this confusing. Go back to where this started. Before the 1970s, date labeling on food in most of the world was either non-existent or limited to genuinely perishable products. Milk, certain meats, where spoilage was real, fast, and detectable. Then something shifted. Refrigeration became universal. Supermarkets expanded. Supply chains lengthened. Food started traveling longer distances over longer time frames, and retailers needed a way to manage inventory rotation. The dates that appeared on labels during this period were born from that logistical need. They were stock management tools. They told employees when to pull products off shelves to make room for fresher inventory. Not because the older inventory was dangerous, but because fresher product sells better and reflects better on the store. The consumer was never the intended audience for these labels. They were reading internal inventory communications and making life decisions based on them. What came next was the consolidation of an industry habit into a cultural belief. By the 1980s and 1990s, date labels had become standard across most packaged food categories worldwide. Consumers had spent a decade and a half treating these dates as safety thresholds. Food companies noticed something important. Products purchased shortly before the printed date tend to get repurchased sooner. If a consumer buys a jar of something with 6 weeks of shelf life remaining, they return to the store in 6 weeks. If the label showed 6 months, the repurchase cycle extends. Shorter perceived shelf life accelerates the replacement cycle. A faster replacement cycle means more units sold. The date on your food is not telling you when it expires. It is participating in a system that determines how often you buy more. There's a layer underneath this that almost nobody talks about. Food manufacturers conduct something called sensory and stability testing, controlled studies where trained panels evaluate products at various points past production to determine when quality begins to meaningfully decline. These studies produce real data, specific windows, and those windows are almost always longer, sometimes significantly longer, than the dates that appear on packaging. The company knows, from its own internal research, that the product is still good well past the printed date. The date they print is chosen conservatively, deliberately, because a consumer who throws something away before it actually fails never has a bad experience with the product. The brand is protected. The consumption cycle accelerates. Two outcomes the company wants, both served by a date that undersells the actual shelf life the company's own science demonstrated. If you enjoy understanding how the world actually works beneath the surface, subscribe. It is the best way to support this work. Drop in the comments what city or country you are watching from. This script is deeply researched using data from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and published findings from the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic's report on the dating system. Now back to it. The cost of this system does not stay inside individual households. It compounds. Food waste at the consumer level generates greenhouse gas emissions as organic material decomposes in landfills. It represents wasted water, the water that grew the crop, hydrated the animal, ran through the processing facility. It represents wasted energy, the fuel that planted and harvested, the electricity that refrigerated, the diesel that transported. Every item thrown away because of a date that was never a safety threshold carries all of that embedded cost with it into the waste stream. The natural resources consumed to produce food that is then discarded based on a marketing label represent one of the largest inefficiencies in the modern food system. And it is not accidental. It is the predictable output of a system that was designed around inventory management and repurchase cycles, not around informing the consumer about actual food safety. Now, look at what actually makes food unsafe. Genuine food spoilage is the result of microbial activity, bacteria, mold, yeast, breaking down the product in ways that can make a person sick or that make the product organically repulsive enough that consumption becomes impossible. Here is the important distinction. In most cases, your body already knows before the science does. Spoiled milk smells before it becomes a health risk. Mold on bread is visible before consumption. Rotten meat produces an odor that makes it essentially impossible to eat without being aware something is wrong. The human sensory system evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to detect exactly this kind of decay. A nose is significantly more accurate than a printed number at determining whether food has crossed the threshold into genuinely unsafe territory. The categories where this does not apply, where real danger can exist without obvious sensory signals, are specific and well documented. Improperly, home-canned low-acid foods can harbor dangerous bacterial toxins without any detectable smell or visual sign. Certain ready-to-eat products susceptible to a specific category of bacterial contamination can carry risk without obvious indicators. These are real exceptions. They are also narrow, specific, and categorically different from the vast majority of packaged food sitting in most people's pantries and refrigerators. But the date label system treats everything with the same blunt instrument, plastering identical-looking dates across canned tomatoes and fresh deli meat as if the safety logic behind both were equivalent. It is not. The system was never designed to communicate that distinction because communicating that distinction would require nuance, and nuance does not accelerate the replacement cycle. Other parts of the world have handled this differently, and the comparison is revealing. Across the European Union, the regulatory framework draws a meaningful legal distinction between best before, which signals quality, and use by, which is reserved for products that present genuine microbiological risk past that date. Throwing away a product past its best before date in the European Union is explicitly described in regulatory guidance as unnecessary waste. The distinction is codified. The confusion is partially addressed by design. Yet, even within this more structured system, consumer behavior still skews heavily toward discarding anything past any printed date, because decades of cultural conditioning have created an association between dates and danger that regulation alone has not been able to undo. That conditioning was built deliberately, not through advertising, not through direct consumer communication, through the absence of explanation. The industry never corrected the misunderstanding because the misunderstanding was profitable. Regulatory bodies did not standardize the system because the political resistance from manufacturers made standardization expensive. And so the gap between what the date means and what people believe it means has persisted for 5 decades, growing more entrenched with every generation of consumers who learned the belief from their parents, who learned it from theirs, who learned it from a label that was never designed to tell them what they thought it was saying. The economics on the other side of this are enormous. The waste reduction organization REFED, Rethinking Food and Economic Development, estimated that confusion over date labels drives billions of dollars in unnecessary food waste annually in the United States alone. Scale that globally across every country with widespread packaged food distribution, and the number becomes almost incomprehensible. Billions of dollars worth of edible food moving from pantry to trash, driven by a date that a marketing team chose partly to protect brand quality perception, and partly because a faster consumption cycle is good for quarterly revenue. The consumer pays twice, once for the product and once indirectly for the environmental cost of throwing it away. There's a mechanical detail about how these dates are physically chosen that almost nobody outside the industry knows. When a company conducts stability testing on a new product, they typically test at multiple time intervals, 90 days, 180 days, 270 days, 1 year, and evaluate sensory quality at each point. When they identify the interval where a panel of trained tasters first detects a meaningful quality difference, they take a safety margin from that point. How large is the safety margin? It varies. There is no industry standard. Some companies apply a 10% margin, some apply 30%, some apply more. The margin is chosen based on internal brand standards, risk tolerance, and commercial strategy, not based on any external regulatory requirement or standardized safety methodology. One company's best buy on an identical product could be 3 months earlier than a competitor's. Both dates are arbitrary relative to actual safety. Both were chosen internally. Neither was disclosed to the consumer choosing between the 2 products on a store shelf. What does this mean for the food sitting in your kitchen right now? Canned goods with no signs of damage, no swelling, no rust, no compromised seal, are almost certainly safe and often still at good quality well past any printed date. Dry goods like rice, pasta, and dried legumes have genuine shelf lives measured in years, often far beyond what any label suggests. Hard cheeses with visible mold can, in most cases, have the mold removed and the remainder safely consumed. Frozen food, kept at a stable temperature, does not become unsafe past a printed date. Quality may decline gradually, but safety is a separate question, and frozen temperatures keep microbial activity essentially suspended. Your nose, your eyes, and your judgment are calibrated instruments that the printed date was never designed to replace. The products that actually warrant close attention to dates are narrow in scope. Fresh, ready-to-eat products, unpasteurized items, certain seafood and poultry preparations, anything that is passed through a temperature-controlled supply chain and depends on that temperature control for safety. These categories exist. The risk is real in them. But applying the anxiety that belongs to fresh deli meat to a sealed can of chickpeas is exactly the category error the current system produces and profits from. One last fact. In 2019, the Consumer Goods Forum, a global network representing the largest food and consumer goods companies on the planet, agreed on a voluntary global standard to reduce date label variations down to just 2 phrases: best if used by for quality and used by for safety. A voluntary agreement, no enforcement mechanism, no mandatory adoption timeline, announced to significant press coverage, largely ignored in practice across global markets. The labels on most packages today look almost identical to the labels from the decade before the agreement. The confusion the industry created has proved more durable than the industry's own attempt to partially address it, because the confusion still works. The date on your food was put there to protect a brand and move product. It was never a promise about your safety, it was a business decision. And somewhere between the lab that tested the real shelf life and the label that printed something shorter, the information that could have actually helped you got left on the table. If this changed how you see something you thought you already understood, subscribe. Every video goes this deep. We will see you in the next one. This matters more when you understand how shelf life testing actually interacts with product reformulation. When a food company adjusts a recipe, changes a preservative, swaps an ingredient, shifts a ratio, they are technically required to retest stability. That retesting costs money and takes time. The pressure to bring a reformulated product to market quickly creates incentives to apply conservative dates from previous testing rounds rather than conducting the full cycle again. So the date on a reformulated product may reflect testing on a version of the product that no longer exists on the shelf. The consumer is reading a number generated by a formula they are no longer eating. The label stayed, the product quietly changed, and the reformulations themselves are worth pausing on. Processed food is not a static thing. The version of a snack food or a condiment or a canned preparation that exists today is almost certainly not the version that existed 15 years ago. Ingredients shift, supply chains substitute, cost pressures drive quiet reformulations that never appear on the front of the package. Manufacturers are generally required to update ingredient lists when substantive changes occur, but the threshold for what counts as substantive leaves significant room. Flavor profile adjustments, texture modifications, minor preservative changes, these can move through the system without triggering the kind of consumer-facing disclosure that would make the reformulation visible. The date on the label is one of the few numbers a consumer might use to evaluate a product's reliability. It is generated by a process that is itself subject to exactly these kinds of quiet shifts. There's a geographic dimension to this that reveals how constructed the entire system is. Take a single product, a global brand of shelf-stable sauce manufactured in one facility, distributed to multiple countries. The identical product, from the identical production run, will carry different printed dates depending on which country it is shipped to, not because the product behaves differently in those countries, because each country's retail environment, competitive landscape, and regulatory tradition shaped what date the company chose to print for that market. The sauce in one country has a date 8 months from production. The same sauce, same batch, printed for a different market, shows 11 months. The product does not know what country it is in. The date is not describing the product. The date is describing the market. Pull that thread further and you reach one of the most consistently underreported facts about the global food system. Expiration date anxiety, the cultural reflex to discard anything past a printed date, is almost entirely a phenomenon of wealthier, high-consumption economies. In large portions of the world where food access is constrained and food cost represents a substantial fraction of household income, the date on the package is understood for what it is, a rough guideline, not a verdict. Food is evaluated by smell, appearance, texture, and taste. These are the oldest food safety instruments human beings have. They predate refrigeration, predate packaging, predate the entire concept of a printed shelf life by hundreds of thousands of years. The populations that rely on them are not taking greater risks than the populations that defer entirely to a label. In many cases, they are applying better calibrated judgment. The irony is that the wealthiest consumers, with the most access to variety, the most ability to replace discarded food, are the ones who have most completely outsourced their food safety judgment to a date that was never designed to provide it. The system extracted that judgment and replaced it with a number, and then it profited from the number. There is one more dimension that ties the entire investigation together. Food waste has a secondary market that the date label system quietly feeds. Products pulled from retail shelves before their dates, because retailers rotate inventory and remove items within a certain window of the printed date, often move into discount channels, food banks, or commodity resale markets. The retail system is not discarding food at the date. It is discarding food well before the date to maintain the quality impression that makes premium pricing possible. The food that leaves the shelf is frequently still well within any reasonable quality window. It moves downstream. Someone else sells it, donates it, or reprocesses it. The date that caused it to leave the premium shelf was protecting the brand's perception, not responding to any real change in the product. So the date does several things simultaneously. It accelerates the home replacement cycle. It drives retail rotation that feeds secondary markets. It protects brand perception by ensuring consumers never encounter a product at the edge of its real shelf life. It generates a cultural anxiety that has become so normalized that most people have never once questioned whether the number they are reading was ever designed to do what they believe it does. It was not. It was designed to do exactly what it has always done. And now you know that.